Today, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We will be going over some of the impacts of that COVID-19 has had so far on international trade. Obviously, this is a very fluid situation, so some of the things we're going to discuss today might be completely different in a week for all we know at this point. But all we can really do is report on what we know at the time and kind of keep a pulse on the news. But we're going to try to give you guys some insight where we can. All right, so my name is Meredith Lambert, and I will be your host and presenter during today's presentation. I'm the marketing manager here at Risk Guaranty, which basically translates to being responsible for researching and creating this educational content for you guys. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. This webinar is presented by Risk Guaranty, or as many of you know us as, TRG. We are located in the heart of downtown Bozeman, Montana, and we have been providing U.S. customs bonds and cargo insurance solutions directly to importers since 1991. This direct-to-importer business model is unique in the international trade community since it cuts out the need for an additional middleman and allows TRG to become another member of your international trade team. If you're ever in Bozeman, feel free to stop on by and say hello. We love to meet, our clients and customers. And unfortunately, not too many make it out here, but it is a beautiful part of the country. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available on our YouTube for future reference. If you want to be notified the moment it releases, I highly recommend you subscribe to our YouTube channel. We also post additional educational videos on YouTube about once a month. So if you are not already, please check the chat box. We're going to be dropping a link in there later for you to subscribe. We will also be sending out a follow-up email after the webinar, which will include that link in case you don't get a chance to subscribe now. You can also find us by searching Trade Risk Guarantee -TRG directly in YouTube. So again, due to the fluid nature of this topic, we have gathered some of the questions submitted prior to the live webinar. We'll be answering a couple of those at the end of this presentation. However, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please submit them via the questions section of the web interface. The questions submitted during the session will be reviewed and answered by either myself or our team of licensed customs brokers and cargo insurance experts. We try to answer those pretty shortly after the webinar. Again, a lot of the questions we got pre-submitted were pretty highly specific to an individual importer's practices. So if when we receive those, we like to reach out personally on a direct contact to really give you a better answer than what we can really provide in a live webinar. But by all means, please still submit them. We love to hear your questions and we love to help where we can. Okay, so as a necessary disclaimer, the information presented in this webinar is for information purposes only, and it is not intended and does not constitute legal advice. This topic contains various circumstances that are very fluid and changing daily, so keeping a pulse on the news sources is the best way to stay up to date on any new announcements. Okay, I'm seeing a couple questions about sound. I'm hoping you guys can all hear me. If you can't, please let us know in the question box now so we can kind of try to make some adjustments before we continue. But just in case, I'm going to keep going. If I see some of those come in, then we'll stop and adjust. Okay, so I'm seeing some people are able to hear me fine, so good. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and hopefully if any of you can't hear us, this will be available on YouTube afterwards, so we'll try to get that fixed. All right, so let's begin. In today's presentation, we will be covering some of the following topics: the overall global response to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of international trade, the impact it has had on U.S. trade agencies, so some of the regulations that have come out in response, The effects on supply chains and what this all means for insurance. There's a lot of details there, but we're just going to kind of cover the basics and some of the ways that you can prepare for the future. All right, so we're going to start with the global response to this pandemic in terms of international trade. All right, as we have all seen throughout the media, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a global scramble for essential medical supplies. So this includes everything from PPE, such as masks, gowns, gloves, and to larger equipment like ventilators. So as a reaction to this, many governments have imposed restrictions on trade in order to protect their own access to these supplies. This has primarily been seen as limits in these governments in terms of what they're allowing people to export, primarily with medical goods, and in reverse of that, easing the restrictions on importing these commodities. So the US has also kind of joined this trend by directing companies not to export masks, respirators, or gloves, and also by easing the process of importing these same goods as well. We are only going to look over kind of two of the major players in this, which is the EU and China. On the EU side of things, there are now requirements for specific export licensing for the exportation of personal protective equipment, or PPE. This includes protective spectacles and visors, face shields, mouth and nose protection equipment, protective garments, and gloves. However, there are exemptions to these restrictions for the countries and territories listed on the bottom of the slide. So you can see that even though, for US importers, importing these items is being made easier, there are still some specific requirements on the manufacturer side, perhaps. So if you're importing from the EU, there's now specific export licensing for these items. So it's not as easy as just deciding to import these. Now on the China side, similarly, China is also enforcing new export requirements on medical products being used to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. The export of these products now requires certification from an authorized testing laboratory, copies of the manufacturer's business license, and the manufacturer's certificate from China's National Medical Products Administration. The products subject to this include COVID-19 test kits, ventilators, medical protective clothing, medical protective masks, medical surgical masks, one-time use medical masks, and infrared thermometers. So again, just some more restrictions in order to export this. So now China is not restricting export in terms of, they're still allowing these items to be exported. And in fact, we'll get into it a little later. Some manufacturers have switched their processes to manufacture more of these items for export, but there are now these new requirements that, basically make it a little bit more difficult. So you will need a certification in order to export these goods. So exports from the US, let's go over some of the restrictions the US has put into place. One of the largest ones here is the restriction of exporting medical supplies from the US. The products listed here on this slide are prohibited from export without FEMA approval, and that will be in effect from April 7th of this year until August 10th of 2020. The products listed come as no surprise. They include, obviously, an N95 filtering face piece respirators, other filtering face piece respirators, including there's quite a few different model types. Elastomeric, can't say that one. Elastomeric air purifying respirators and appropriate particle filters and cartridges. PPE surgical masks, PPE gloves or surgical gloves. and then other products that were determined necessary and subsequently published in the Federal Register. So again, this is kind of an example of how fluid the situation is. These are the initial products that were included in that restriction, but there's kind of an ever-evolving list that the Federal Register is or will be published on the Federal Register. This does not mean that they're, adding items every day, but this kind of gives them the opportunity to add items as they need. Now, there is an exception to that regulation, and that applies to shipments that are made by or on behalf of U.S. manufacturers with continuous export agreements with customers in other countries since at least January 1st of 2020. So long as at least 80% of the manufacturer's domestic production of covered materials on a per item basis was distributed in the US in the preceding 12 months. So you can see here that they're kind of allowing companies with an existing agreement continue to export those goods, but there obviously is certain parameters that they have to meet. This is just another way, the US, like every other country in the world, is just trying to safeguard our own health and safety as well. And this is one of the ways, and that's really being overseen by FEMA. And then a lot of that is also being enforced by the Department of Homeland Security. So a lot of multi-agency overlap here. All right, so now that we see some countries are restricting the exportation of medical supplies, but what other effects has the coronavirus had on supply chains? Overall, this pandemic has exposed the fragility of global supply chains and brought into acute focus the shortages of critical medical components needed in the fight against the pandemic. So countries that have been more ravaged by this pandemic have found it hard to provide adequate medical care due to shortages of critical medical equipment such as ventilators, protective masks, and other gear. To put some of that into context, before the pandemic, China produced approximately half of the world's face masks. As the infection spread across China, their exports came to pretty much a complete halt. Now, as the infection spreads globally, and the transmissions in China have, obviously slowed since then, China has begun once again exporting masks to other countries. In order to make up for the downtime, and help the global cause, factories are being repurposed to manufacture essential and medical supplies. However, it is difficult to repurpose a factory. You have to obviously repurpose the factory, retain the workers, retrain those workers, arrange new suppliers, and acquire necessary certifications like the ones we discussed previously. So these types of pivots in manufacturing take time. One significant challenge lies in the distribution and logistics of supply chains. These two parts of the process are very people intensive, and many employees are unable to work as a result of the pandemic. Also, a lot of the restrictions put in place or safety precautions put in place have just made it a lot more difficult for employees to perform their job when they are allowed to perform their job. To take a closer look at manufacturing, plants that have been able to continue production are still being disrupted by the social distancing requirements. In a report conducted by the Institute for Supply Management, it was reported that US domestic manufacturing is operating at 79% of normal capacity. Chinese manufacturing is at about 53% of normal capacity. And European manufacturing is at about 50% of normal capacity. So this was as of last week. This survey was conducted, so some of these numbers may have shifted since. Chinese manufacturing has been, climbing upward. US has maybe been a little bit more in the middle there, kind of more on the downward trend. So we might see some of these numbers change. I mean, obviously they will change pretty quickly with this situation. So taking a look at the transportation aspect, the quarantine has had a major effect on the labor force responsible for loading and piloting ships and planes. As we move forward through this pandemic, it becomes imperative to assess whether transport services will have the capacity to ship existing inventory in the case of a crisis. Also, if there is a backlog and a resulting lack of transport space, shipping costs might increase substantially. This is something that's um, pretty hard to predict at the moment. There's a lot of speculation going around, and we are actually preparing kind of a more in-depth blog post on this as well. But this is something that, you know, we can kind of see this going up. There's been a lot of questions on, well, you know, the cost of fuel is down, so how is the cost of transportation still up? A lot of that has to do with the labor force responsible. So when, you know, obviously there's less people that are able to work, or, you know, maybe they're able to work, but there's being restrictions on the amount of people allowed to work at a time due to social distancing, that just makes it more difficult to get these ships fully loaded, and, you know, and it makes it slower getting them loaded. So that all of that adds up to a potential cost increase, also potential delays and things like that. So one major takeaway is that disaster recovery plans have become an essential defense against the ramifications of these types of events in the future. We'll get into more details on this later in the presentation, and obviously it's a little bit like hindsight's 2020, but this is one of the major takeaways here is, you know, what can we learn from what has happened and move forward. So another major factor affected by the shutdown in manufacturing and transportation is lead time. You know, really the lead time that it takes to source and then also receive the goods. So average lead times for inputs are at least twice as long as compared to normal operations. If we look at China, Korea, Japan, Europe, and even domestically sourced inputs, all of these lead times at the moment are longer by about 200% or more. This is another part of that survey conducted by the Institute for Supply Management. So, you know, this is obviously affecting lead times globally, and including domestically. Even people that purchase domestically are still having the same slowdown on lead time. So as much as we talk about the transportation of goods, it really all kind of boils down to that manufacturing element. So now let's focus specifically on the impacts felt at ports of entry around the world. Worldwide, the effect of port congestion has been felt. The Federal Maritime Commission has launched an initiative aimed at addressing port congestion and related challenges in the U.S. freight delivery system related to the pandemic. But that does not change what has already taken place, and we can look at some of those causes for this congestion. So that would be the lockdown and restricting of movement, failure to pick up cargo and containers. Warehouses are full or even closed in some cases. Some ports remain open but have a reduced workforce. Cargo lying uncollected at ports creates congestion and takes up space, reducing capacity for incoming cargo containers. And then force majeure, which force majeure, we're going to kind of use that term a lot. This basically refers, it's a legal term that refers to an act of God. We've seen a kind of spike in preemptive claims and legal liability in, you know, citing force majeure, which is currently kind of up in the air of what's covered and what's not. We don't really get too much into that in this webinar, but this has kind of been another thing that's been slowing all of this down. You know, when you have a claim like that, sometimes it means that they can't move the goods, or, you know, they need to go take pictures of the goods, things like that. So there's just a lot of these factors that are kind of slowing everything down. Now all we know and understand, or sorry, now we all know and understand the importance of quarantining and social distancing. So we really just want to assess and acknowledge what the result of these measures have been on the ports. So, you know, we want to kind of refrain from casting any kind of opinion on this situation. This is the reality of the situation, and the results of that have been highly congested ports. Now, in the United States, the U.S. Coast Guard has said earlier this month that cargo ships will be allowed into US ports even if they have been to China within the previous 14 days, as long as they have no sick crew members. So crew members would have to remain on their vessel except to conduct specific activities directly related to vessel cargo and provisioning operations. So this basically means that shipments are still coming in. They are, being allowed to enter into the US, but at a slower and more restricted pace. So between February 11th and April 1st, container ship operators canceled 40 sailings at the Port of Los Angeles, mostly for vessels coming from China. That amounts to little more than 1/4 of the overall number of ships that would typically call at that port during that time. And the Port of Los Angeles is one of the busiest ports in the United States. So as for the ports in China, shipping volume plunged in the wake of the initial shutdowns as industrial production slowed and in some cases halted completely. 2 months after a near complete standstill in China, the country's ports are again pushing out thousands of containers that were stranded at the onset of the outbreak. So when things completely shut down, there were a lot of ships and even just cargo containers waiting at the port that were pretty much abandoned, that have now been, they are now working to get those out. So this is another reason for a lot of the slowdown. The massive buildup of boxes at docks in China left a big shortfall in cargo at ports in the US and Europe since early February, and created a shortage of empty containers that Western exporters need to ship everything from farm products to electronic products. So I'm sure you're all familiar with, a cargo container comes in from China, it is unloaded, and then goods are then loaded back into it and it is sent off to, its next destination. So when you have something that slows that down at point A, well then obviously point B, C, D, all of those are going to be affected. So just, more cause and effect situations. Now, if we take a look at China's Purchasing Managers Index, also known as PMI, we can see a major decline by about 22 points in February of 2020. The PMI is a critical production index that highly correlates with the country's export volume. A decline of 22 points implies a reduction in exports of about 2% on an annualized basis. In more simple terms, this drop observed in February spread over the year equates to a -2% in the supply of goods. The Purchasing Managers Index is an index summarized, as a little background, an index summarized and compiled through the results of the monthly survey of enterprises' purchasing managers. It covers every link of the enterprise, including purchasing, production, logistics, and so on. It is one of the leading indexes which was commonly adopted by international society to monitor the macroeconomic trends and plays an important role in forecasting and monitoring. If the threshold of PMI, the threshold of PMI is usually 50%. That's kind of the cutoff point for economic performance. If the PMI is above 50%, it reflects the manufacturing economy is expanding. If it is less than 50%, it reflects the manufacturing economy is in a recession. So we can see that the PMI has bounced back to 52% in March of 2020. This is due to the fact that more than 90% of China's state-owned enterprises have resumed production. Although it is still true that the number of small and mid-sized enterprises back at work in China was lower than barely 1/3. So we've seen definitely, China has is on the upswing. They are, 90% back at capacity, but that is primarily the state-owned enterprises, so the larger manufacturers mostly. Okay, so we've taken a look at how the coronavirus has affected international trade kind of on a broad global scale, but now let's look specifically at the response of the US trade agencies. So starting with some specific requests that have come in from US and Customs Border Protection, we have seen a widespread request for increased use of their automated commercial environment, also known as ACE. CBP recommends the use of automated systems to minimize COVID-19 exposure and sustain trade activities. So this includes everything from transmitting entry and filing entry summaries, updating account and contact information, submitting supporting documents or responses to requests for information, and transmitting post-summary activities. So all of these things we've kind of always been able to do electronically. It's a big part of what we even do here at TRG is doing all of these things electronically. If in the past you have done some of these in person with physical documents, they are requesting that you do them now electronically. So there has been an effort by CBP to expedite the import of COVID-19 relief items. CBP's Pharmaceuticals, Health and Chemical Center of Excellence and Expertise has established the COVID-19 Cargo Resolution Team. This is in an effort to coordinate inquiries regarding the importation of medical supplies and personal protective equipment. Goods included in the expedited process are goods imported for relief efforts and charitable organizations. For the most updated news directly from CBP on coronavirus announcements, they have put together a web page where all those updates can be found. You can use the link seen on the screen here to access that page and keep an eye out for updates. Again, this is a very fluid situation and new announcements are coming out daily, so we highly encourage everyone to pay close attention to that webpage. We also will be sending this out in the follow-up email if you don't have a chance to write down that link now. That webpage not only has some FAQ elements to it, it also has a direct feed pulled from the CSMS, the messaging system, where it only pulls in the messages, the updates surrounding the topic of coronavirus. So this really is the best place to kind of get immediate updates from customs with what's going on. Obviously, some of those you'll want to then dive deeper into, but this will at least give you kind of the first overview of what's going on with CBP. So non-essential travel is also being limited or prohibited between the US, Canada, and Mexico. This was effective from March 21st through April 20th. However, exempt from this restriction were those engaged in lawful cross-border trade. Therefore, truck drivers supporting the movement of cargo between the US and Canada or Mexico were still able to move imported goods through those countries. So we did get some questions about, were trucks going to be stopped, things like that. You can see that while, whenever we see in the news non-essential travel, things like that being prohibited, typically this does not include international trade unless it, is specified. So during that time, we still saw the movement of goods. Granted, it was slowed down by a lot of these social distancing and quarantining efforts. All right, now, there have been some significant impacts on the ongoing trade war. The biggest being that the Office of the USTR has granted additional Section 301 tariff exclusions for additional medical and other products from China. The products included in this include medical masks, examination gloves, and antiseptic wipes. For a full list of the HTS US codes granted an exclusion, please refer to the publications available on the Federal Registrar. This really is the best way to access those full list. We will be coming out with kind of an updated summary of that, which we're going to be sending out. But this is, if you have never been on the Federal Registrar site before, this is where those publications are in full, so you can actually read the direct publication from the government. So the best way to access these is to go to that website, which is www.federalregistrar.gov. In the search bar on the homepage, you can search the exact document citation number. I have the 3 here listed that are that have these HTS codes in them. So you'll actually want to type out in that search box 85 FR 13970, for instance. These publications are typically titled something along the lines of Notice of Product Exclusions, China Acts Policies and Practices Related to Technology Transfer, Intellectual Property, and Innovation. Pretty much all three will be titled that, but with a different document citation number. There have been 3 documents published at this time listing exclusions in response to the pandemic. So these are the ones that were initially granted exclusions pretty immediately by the USTR. Now, if your product has not been excluded, but it might still qualify, there is currently an open comment period to submit your request for an exclusion. These exclusions are only on goods or inputs to goods that are useful in fighting or treating COVID-19. If you fit that description and were denied an exclusion in the past, you are able to reapply during this comment period given these new circumstances. All the comments are due by June 25th, 2020. Comments will be evaluated on a rolling basis, making it important to file early to avoid a likely rush of requests. And again, for full details, search the specific document citation on the Federal Registrar website. This publication includes further details and instructions on how to submit your request for an exclusion. It's also part of the process to request your exclusion is actually to comment on this document citation. So you really will need to go there to begin this process. Now, another aspect of the impact coronavirus has had on the trade war that we are kind of unable to know at this time how it will fully impact this is how it will impact the phase 1 deal already signed and any future deals. A stipulation of the phase 1 deal was that China would be purchasing $200 billion worth of products from the United States. However, with the coronavirus outbreak, it is hard to tell if this will be possible. Even now, considering the effect of the global economy, not even considering the effect of the global economy, the drag on supply chains alone will be a hindrance. As for future deals, all political focus at the moment has really shifted to dealing with the pandemic. There has really been little to no news on the status of a phase 2 deal at this time. So we really don't expect to hear much on this, at least currently. I would hope that we would hear something, maybe during the summer, that we would start to at least get a better gauge of what's going on with phase 1, what's going on with phase 2. The original idea here was that there was going to be a phase 2 in process and hopefully signed by the fall. So that's, I'm sure, been delayed now. So we'll have to kind of keep an eye on the news there and see how this all shakes out pretty much. Okay, so now this is the big one. I'm sure all of you have been waiting for this topic. So the 90-day duty deferral, also known as the 90-day duty tax and fee postponement. You'll kind of hear it officially called the duty postponement. Colloquially, everybody has kind of been referring to it as the duty deferral. So on April 19th, which was this past Sunday, the president issued an executive order to temporarily extend deadlines for estimated duty, tax, and fee payments for importers suffering significant financial hardships as a result of the COVID-19 national emergency declaration and shutdowns. One odd component of this is that the temporary postponement applies only to consumption entries made on or after March 1st of 2020 and no later than April 30th, 2020. So at TRG, we have discussed the possibility of this timeline being extended into May, but there are really no official discussions that we've seen at this time. So at this moment, this time frame stands. The reason I say that it's a little odd is because that time frame is almost over. We are already at April 23rd, and this time frame ends April 30th. So it's a little odd that we see something like this, but Again, something to keep in mind, something to start acting on immediately if you're able to, which we'll go into more of that in a second. And also to keep an eye on the news to see if this has been extended. We really don't know what's going to happen with this. Even before, when this was kind of first brought up, there were talks of doing a duty deferral. And then it was pretty promptly said that no, they were not going to do this. It was kind of a hard stop no. And then on Sunday, we see that they announced that they're doing it. So again, very fluid situation. We all just have to keep an eye on the news. But let's get into some of the details we do know. So the temporary postponement does not permit the return of any deposits of estimated duties, taxes, and or fees that have already been paid. Therefore, if you made an entry within that time frame and have already paid the estimated duties, taxes, and fees, there will be no refunds issued. During this time, no new penalty, liquidated damage claim, or other sanction will be imposed for the delayed deposit of estimated duties, taxes, and fees in accordance with a deadline postponed under this section. So this means that if you made an entry, 2 weeks ago, and you were unable to pay the duties at that time, there will be no liquidated damage claim issued, at least until the end of that 90-day period. So your duties for that have now been deferred automatically. If you have already paid, there are no refunds. So there really is no going back on that. So let's break this down a little further. First off, who qualifies for this duty deferral? To qualify, an importer must demonstrate a significant financial hardship. What does this mean? Well, this is one of the times we've actually gotten a pretty solid definition of what customs will consider a significant financial hardship. They consider it that an eligible importer's operation must be fully or partially suspended during March or April of 2020 due to orders from a competent governmental authority limiting commerce, travel, or group meetings because of COVID-19. And as a result of such a suspension, the gross receipts of the eligible importer for March 13th through the 31st, 2020, or all of April 2020, are less than 60% of the gross receipts for the comparable period in 2019. So this is a pretty measurable component that we've gotten, requirement that we've gotten from customs of what constitutes a financial hardship in their eyes. Now, the most important part of this is that an eligible importer does not need to file any additional documentation with CBP to be eligible for this relief. However, and this is important, you must maintain documentation as part of your books and records establishing that your business meets the requirements for this relief. So due to the rapid pace at which this is being implemented, the requirement process is kind of beginning with trust. If you do not qualify for this relief and you take advantage of it by not paying your duties, taxes, and fees within the typical time frame, in the future, CBP will be able to request that you submit your business records from this time in order to verify whether you qualify or not. It is unclear how many requests like this CBP may make in the future, but it is always possible that they will require any and all importers that deferred their duties to submit their records in the future. So really make sure that you keep those records organized and ready for when they're requested. And also just make sure that you actually qualify before you are taking advantage of this duty deferral. And again, this was another kind of big question we had from a lot of importers, which was, what do I need to do to apply for duty deferral? You don't need to do anything. At this point, if you make an entry and you don't pay your duties, customs is immediately deferring your duty for 90 days. So you really need to make sure that you qualify yourself. Okay, so now what does not qualify for duty deferral? So this temporary postponement does not apply to deadlines for the payment of other debts to CBP. This includes deadlines for the payment of bills for duties, taxes, and fees and interest determined to be due upon liquidation or reliquidation, which translates into supplemental duty bills. Deadlines for the payment of fees authorized pursuant to 19 USC 58C, except for merchandise processing fees and dutiable mail fees, and deadlines for the payment of any penalty or liquidated damages due to CBP. So what this means is that while no new liquidated damage fees may be issued, any that are currently due to customs will still be subject to the typical 60-day time frame. And that's the same with supplemental duty bills. If you have any supplemental duty bills that are currently due, those will still need to be paid, and you will not be able to defer any kind of payment under this regulation. As for 19 USC 58C, this refers to other customs duties, and that includes things such as passenger processing fees, which will still be due as normal. One interesting note to the team at TRG has encountered is that they are granting extensions on liquidated damage claims for the payment of those. But you have to submit the request in writing to the Fines, Penalties, and Forfeiture Office directly. The written request must contain an explanation of the financial hardship and why the business is unable to pay at this time. This is on a port-to-port case and is not a formal process at the moment, but it is something our TRG claims team has been able to help importers get done at this time. All right, so other types of entries that do not qualify are entries subject to anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, Section 232, Section 301, and Section 201. Duty payments on these entries will still be due in the typical time frame. So now, what if you have a shipment coming in that contains some commodities subject to one of these and, that don't qualify, and some commodities that are not subject and do qualify for duty deferral? Well, if you make the entry for that shipment in one single entry summary, the entire entry summary would not qualify for duty deferral. So CBP is telling importers to file separate entry summaries for this one shipment. One entry summary that includes the commodities that qualify for duty deferral, and one that includes the commodities that do not qualify for duty deferral. So basically, if you are making an entry and you have 5 commodities on there that qualify for duty deferral, and you have one that is subject to 301 duties and therefore does not qualify for duty deferral, the entire entry summary, that entire entry, does not qualify for duty deferral. So you want to make sure that in your importing process, if you are wanting to take advantage of this 90-day duty deferral, that you split those out and file separate entry summaries for them. So let's look forward a bit and consider what this means in the long term. Eligible importers will be required to pay the full postponed duty amount at the end of the 90-day window. Remember that as an importer of record on the entries, you will still be liable on the customs bond once the duties, taxes, and fees are due. Therefore, non-payment at the time the duties are due may result in a claim on your bond. If a claim goes unaddressed and payment is not made, this will lead to the termination of your bond, and the surety will pursue reimbursement for any losses on that bond. So while this 90-day postponement is good news for the short term, keep in mind how it may impact your business in the long term as well. All right, so now let's pivot a little bit and go over some of how COVID-19 has impacted insurance, or what it really means for insurance. Overall, we have seen an uptick on how closely cargo owners, importers, risk managers, and insurers need to monitor the following: the accumulation of cargo, delay, their delay clauses, demurrage charges, deviation, force majeure, and interruptions in transit. This is primarily due to the lack of workforce at manufacturers and ports around the world. Also, the precaution of keeping cargo ships docked offshore for 2 weeks has also increased the time frame of those delays. The most widespread type of disruption we have seen throughout this time is caused by the limited workforce available and the fact that cargo is being held for longer than usual. These two factors cause delay in the delivery of goods, which can not only be disruptive to your business operations, but can also lead to inherent vice. Inherent vice is a quality within a commodity that causes it to damage or destroy itself. The best example of this would be food, which will eventually rot when it's left on its own, as opposed to, an iPhone, which you could leave in a box for a year and it will be the same. Well, mostly. In most insurance policies, things like delay, inherent vice, and additional costs associated with these two are not covered under the policy. So this is a really good time to review your current insurance policy and outline what is covered and what is not. If delay is not covered, see what is, or if there are any enhancement clauses that can or should be added to your policy. In the past, we have seen spikes in the number of insurance claims when there is an event like a port strike or something that causes major delay in the delivery of goods. So this turbulent time will most likely lead to a similar outcome. So really, preparation is key. And speaking of preparation, we typically like to include some more actionable items at the end of a webinar to kind of help guide you on what you can do now. Unfortunately, this time, this section was a little harder to put together since everyone's experience during this pandemic is so unique. However, we wanted to go over a few things that now that the unpredictable has happened, so we can better prepare for the future. It may seem obvious, but now is the time to assess your open risk, consider pragmatic, tailored solutions, and put protocols in place in order to act promptly in the future to mitigate damage and safeguard vital business functions. The following are a few supply chain challenges and key considerations to keep in mind when faced with potential or actual supply chain disruptions. First off, be practical. Don't make a plan that is harder to enact than the usual protocol. Make cuts where necessary and consider how adjustments will affect multiple aspects of your business. So how will, stopping one aspect of your supply chain affect another? Evaluate your legal options based on the contracts in place. Now is a great time to look over the contracts you have in place and reassess your needs. Does your current contract cover you in the event of a global pandemic? This is obviously a big one. This is something that, we all might have thought, you never had to think about, and now obviously is going to highly impact how business is done in the future, since this will now be a new thing that we are all very well aware of. Make sure you understand the relationships along your supply chain to minimize unexpected disruptions. So understand how a crisis will impact the relationships you have in place. Do you have the supplier in an area hit harder than others? What procedures do they have in place, to make sure that you minimize disruptions as much as possible? Now, what can you do to manage risk when faced with immediate supply chain problems? Well, kind of have a few here, go in some details of them. First off, identify the exact nature of the supply chain problems and document them. Up-to-date knowledge of the facts is crucial for proper management decisions, and your ability to prove those facts may determine your success in any subsequent legal proceedings. So if your company is directly affected, make sure you understand the reasons why you were unable to supply. Is it due to government-ordered factory shutdowns or quarantines, staff illnesses, staff staying home out of fear, or other reasons? Identifying the exact nature of the problem is critically important, and you should secure evidence proving the cause of your specific problem. If your supplier cannot supply you, do not accept an unspecified force majeure declaration. but ask for details about how exactly your supplier is affected. Do not take a position on the force majeure declaration before you know the relevant facts. All right, so analyze the risk allocation under your contract and the governing law. Not every contract and governing law provides for a force majeure defense based on unforeseeable events outside the party's control. A careful legal analysis of your specific situation is indispensable and will depend on the exact nature of your supply problems, the specific terms of your contract, and the governing law. If you find yourself facing a force majeure defense by your supplier and as a result cannot supply your own customers, you need to assess the risk allocation under each contract separately to develop the best risk management strategy. So say what needs to be said, but be aware of the pitfalls. Specific contract terms or the governing law may require you to give prompt notice of a force majeure event, failing which this defense will be barred. If there is such a requirement, you may need to issue a force majeure declaration before you have the opportunity to complete your assessment of the first 2 points above. If you receive a force majeure declaration from your supplier, carefully frame your response to protect your legal position, and if you must then issue a force majeure declaration to your own customers, avoid any language that could, prejudice your position in a future dispute with your supplier. So basically, you want to tread carefully on these things. There's a lot of action being taken very quickly during this time, and you want to make sure that you do your research if you can and have the most information as possible when you can. And if you have to take action before you're able to do that, make sure that you're treading lightly. Make efforts to overcome the supply problems. So many contracts and governing laws exclude a force majeure defense if you can overcome the consequences of the force majeure event. So often you cannot rely on a force majeure defense to avoid significantly higher costs of supplying alternative goods, unless you're entitled to invoke hardship, which is rare under most governing bodies or governing laws. If you receive a force majeure declaration that you consider invalid, you are obligated to take steps to mitigate your damages. Document all your efforts to overcome the supply problems, particularly if they are unsuccessful. Beware of how you allocate existing supplies. If your reduced production output allows you to supply only one of your customers, allocating the available supplies is tricky. Carefully check your contract and the governing law as to whether they contain any restrictions or guidance. Supplying your priority customers and declaring force majeure vis-a-vis all other customers may be problematic. If you receive a force majeure declaration, find out how your supplier allocates remaining stock as well. And then manage contract disputes proactively to resolve them efficiently. Managing contract disputes proactively will increase your chances of resolving them efficiently and successfully. Engage with your suppliers and customers in a cooperative and reasonable manner. At the same time, take all necessary steps to protect your legal and evidentiary position in the event a dispute escalates. And check your contract's dispute resolution clause to identify what court or tribunal would decide a dispute and how the adjuster would likely assess the situation. So I know that's kind of a lot, but these are just some of the things that you should keep in mind when these problems arise. It is a lot to take in and think about, but overall, basically the name of the game is to really be aware of the contracts that you have in place. Again, this is an unprecedented time, and a lot of the contracts and policies that we have in place did not consider this as an option. So, we now have a new challenge to overcome, which is figuring out where we fall. All right, so some supply chain precautions, a little bit lighter than our last slide. So developing an agile approach to anticipated problems will increase in importance as the global economy becomes more complex. So again, it's going to be a whole new landscape after all of this. After this pandemic, does come to an end, we will be facing new challenges as business owners and as importers. There will be new regulations in place. There will be new contract details that we need to consider. So really, the more agile you can be in this, the better. Also, the more diverse your supply chain is as well. So I think we go into that in the next slide. So I'll wait on that one. Establishing a plan with shipping partners for such events might not totally offset the cost increase. However, it can create space in the budget for it. Additionally, locating alternative supplies or alternative routes and carriers ahead of time can allow companies to circumvent delays entirely. So again, the more agile your business approach is, the less you are locked in, the more you are able to pivot and move with these unlikely circumstances. Events like this one really reinforce the need for companies to have a detailed logistical plan in place to compensate for any shortages and delays that are likely to result. All right, so it is crucial to diversify your source of supplies so that when one supplier is impacted, you can turn to another. So really having a plan B, maybe even a C and a D. At present, companies that rely on one supplier in a COVID-19 affected area, for instance in China, have faced the biggest challenges. Good supply chain practice mandates several suppliers in different countries and geographies. This practice will minimize the risk of disruptions that are likely to increase in the future, whether they are related to pandemics, climate change, or another global phenomena. So also take this time, we've kind of touched on force majeure quite a bit in the, previous couple slides, but this is a great time to update your force majeure clauses. You should update your template force majeure clause for future contracts or renegotiate contracts to make certain it covers common problems in the event of a global pandemic or other similar disruptive phenomena. So pay special attention to your dispute resolution clause. This contract clause will determine whether you can effectively enforce your rights. For important contracts where you are the supplier but rely on a sub-supplier, aim to agree in both contracts on compatible dispute resolution clauses that will enable you to resolve virus-related supply disputes under both contracts in a single legal proceeding. So try to make it easier on yourself in the future as well. Okay, so we definitely have gone over time, the time that we were hoping this would take. I knew this was going to be a pretty long one. So we really don't have, much time to go over a lot of Q&As in this. I did put together a couple really quick ones that were submitted prior to the presentation and that were not already answered within the slides themselves. But again, we will be reaching out after the webinar if you've submitted questions during the webinar. Also, for any of those that were pre-submitted that we have not answered yet, we will be reaching out after the webinar. So as a quick answer to this one, this first one was, what about liquidation? Will there be relaxation in existing bonds liquidation to ease for importers? So the biggest relief provided to importers at this time would be that 90-day duty deferral we went over earlier. As for the liquidation process for entries already made into the US, we do not expect there to be a change in that timeframe overall. Also, as mentioned, any currently outstanding amounts due to CBP are still due as normal unless you have submitted a direct written request that has been granted. However, according to the publication, during the timeframe allotted for duty deferral, which is March 1st through April 30th, there will be no new liquidated damages or supplemental duty bills issued, which will be a type of relief for some importers. So we also received a number of questions regarding sanitation efforts taken in warehouses and how goods should be sanitized when they arrive and things like that. Ultimately, this is something we do not really have the authority to speak on since we are not health professionals. The best I can do is point you to the CDC's website where there are a number of resources on this topic. The link on the slide is an article specifically about best practices for disinfecting business facilities. So if this is something that you are concerned about, there's actually some great resources there, including PDFs that you can download. Again, I will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain this link. I know it's kind of a long one, so if you're not able to write it down right now, it will be available after the webinar. All right, so I'm going to go over quickly about TRG's unique position in the market. Again, we sell directly to consumers, so rather than purchase through a third party, we're going to help you out by letting you buy direct. And that gives you an option for lower pricing and very competitive customer service and claims assistance. In addition to providing U.S. Customs bonds, we also write all risk annual cargo insurance policies. We are also proud to announce that we are able to offer more flexible pricing options than ever in an effort to help importers protect their cargo while protecting their immediate cash flow during this unprecedented time. All of our policies are written through Lloyd's of London or XL Catlin markets. Now, Lloyd's of London is the largest insurance market in the world. They basically created cargo insurance. XL Catlin is a domestic provider that enables us to underwrite policies at a low price. Now, we offer local representation. If you have a loss, you are going to be speaking directly with Felicia and her team. And that doesn't mean that we can't handle a loss anywhere. We have representatives around the world ready to help in the case of a loss to make sure that you get paid the right amount as quickly as possible. Finally, our policies are custom. We offer 3 international, domestic, and warehouse coverage, and they are wrapped around your business. These are not blanket policies. These are not off-the-shelf policies. These are policies written directly for you based on your business, making sure you have the coverage you need. Our annual all-risk policies start at some of the lowest annual costs in the market. So, please reach out if this is something that you're looking to get into place, and we can provide you a custom quote. So thank you all for taking the time to attend our webinar today. I know I went pretty extremely over what we originally predicted for this presentation. We know this is a very confusing and again, unprecedented time, and the TRG team really wants to help provide support where we can. So if you have any additional questions that you weren't able to submit during the webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly by email at marketing@traderiskguarantee.com. Additionally, check our blog at traderiskguarantee.com/TRGpeak. It's got a treasure trove of excellent articles and information. And don't forget to find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course, YouTube. We will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with links from the presentation, so look out for that in your inbox. And again, thank you so much for attending today's webinar.